Hi, it's Dr. D. I hope you're well. I miss being with you in person. My format for these lessons until the end of the semester are as follows, and I did lay it out in my initial education discussion last week. First of all, you'll hear a little YouTube introduction on the topic, as today we're going to talk about the requiem. Number two, you'll have musical examples mentioned in the introduction in your e-portfolio, or you can also watch them on YouTube. Number three, you will have questions for each subject matter that can be answered in education or in an email with a deadline of Wednesday at 5 of the following week. Just a note that I expect at least a paragraph for each one of the responses. That means a capital letter and a period at the end, and approximately 5 to 6 sentences minimum. If you have questions, you can email me. So today we're going to talk about the requiem. Now, we have spoken about the requiem before because basically it's a work that was part of the church repertoire, only because these are the prayers that would have been sung for when a person died. In the case of the Romantic period, we start to notice people like Berlioz and Brahms. They actually create this huge performance piece, but it's still based on those prayers. You would think that that you would associate with the requiem in the case of Berlioz, but differently. Brahms took a different approach, and he used different prayers to set the music, and he set them in German instead of in Latin. So we'll talk about that differentiation. He called it a German requiem. Sometimes we always wonder, only because it's not really the requiem as we see as being a piece that was for the Mass for the Dead in the Catholic tradition. Just to remind you from the past, the Berlioz's dates, 1803 to 1869. He was a composer, a conductor, a writer. You have to remember the very famous Symphonie Fantastique in 1830, where he does use the Dies Irae, but he uses a tune that everybody knew, which was the Dies Irae of the medieval period, credited to Thomas of Celano. Now, when we are talking about this requiem, the Mass for the Dead, or the Grand Mass de Mort, you're going to notice that when we get to the prayer of the Dies Irae, which is the second movement, he will not use that tune, but he will use the text of the Dies Irae. A couple things that I do want you to know about this work. Of course, Berlioz was always talking about being big and what have you, and he calls it the Grand Mass de Mort, but basically it's a requiem. It was done in 1837, but some parts of it came from his 1825 Mass, so it's not everything that was from just one period of his lifetime. It's in Latin, it's in 10 movements, and the second movement, of course, is the Dies Irae. It was commissioned by the Minister of Interior because they were celebrating the 7th anniversary of the Revolution of July 1830, and it was honoring fallen heroes. When you listen to this, the most amazing part about it is the 4 brass bands, along with an orchestra of 140 players, 16 kettle drums, and a chorus of 210 voices. It's a large work. And when he actually used those brass bands in the tuba mirum, which is when the trumpets actually come out in the text, is that we notice that he puts them stereophonically around the room. So therefore, they're all coming in at different time periods. Very difficult, of course, to conduct. You're going to be listening to this Dies Irae movement. For those people that listened to it the very first time with Berlioz writing about it, I just wanted to give you a summary of what Berlioz said. My forces have been divided into several groups spread over a wide area, necessarily so because the 4 brass bands, which I use in the tuba mirum, which have been placed beyond the main body of performers, one at each corner. At the point where they enter at the beginning of the tuba mirum, which follows the Dies Irae without a pause, the music broadens to a tempo twice as slow. First, all 4 groups break in simultaneously at the new tempo, then successively challenging and answering each other from a distance, the entries piling up, each a third higher than the one before. It is therefore of the utmost importance to indicate the 4 beats of the slower tempo very clearly the moment it is reached. Otherwise, the Great Cataclysm, a musical representation of the Last Judgment, prepared for with such deliberation and employing an exceptional combination of forces in a manner at the time unprecedented and not attempted since. A passage which will, I hope, endure as a landmark in music, is mere noise and pandemonium, a monstrosity. With my habitual mistrust, I had stayed just behind Habeneck. Habeneck was the one that was asked to conduct instead of Berlioz being asked to conduct, which I think really upset Berlioz in his own right because it was his composition. Standing with my back to him, I supervised the group of timpani, which he could not see, as the moment approached for them to join in the general tumult. There are perhaps 1,000 bars in my requiem. In the very bar I have been speaking of, the bar in which the tempo broadens and the brass proclaim their tremendous fanfare, the one bar, in fact, in which the conductor's direction is absolutely indispensable, Habeneck laid down his baton and calmly, producing his snuff box, proceeded to take a pinch of snuff. I had been keeping my eye on him. In a flash I turned on my heel, sprang forward in front of him, and stretching out my arm, marked out the 4 great beats of the new tempo. The bands followed me, and everything went off in order. I conducted the piece to the end. The effect I had dreamed of was attained. When at the final words of the chorus Habeneck saw that the tuba mirum was saved, he said, "God, I was in a cold sweat. Without you, we would have been lost." "I know," I replied, looking him straight in the eye. And I didn't say another word. Had he done it deliberately? Was it possible that he was in collusion with others and had actually planned and attempted to carry out an act of such treachery? I would rather not think so, yet I cannot doubt it, God forgive me, if I'm doing him an injustice. So that actually comes from Berlioz's memoirs, as he remembers that very first performance. In my digication, I do include the translation of the Latin so that you can see the English translation of the Latin at the points, especially in the tuba mirum, so you can understand really what's happening. Just note that the Latin prayer, the Dies Irae, is used in this Mass, meaning the text is used, but it is not the medieval chant that you heard of the Symphonie Fantastique. It is not that. It ends up being Berlioz's own melody with that old text from the Mass for the Dead. Just to let you know how Berlioz felt about this work, at the end of his life he wrote, "If I were threatened with the destruction of everything I have created, except for one work, I would beg mercy for the Requiem." So you know how he felt about his work. The other work that I wanted to talk about that is a Requiem, but it has different characteristics, and that's, again, it's a performance piece, is by Johannes Brahms. Now, the last time that we talked about Johannes Brahms, we actually talked about him because we were talking about Robert Schumann, and when Schumann got the ringing in his ear and he ends up throwing himself into the Rhine and going into the asylum, it's Brahms that kind of comes to help Clara with the children, hopefully thinking that maybe when Schumann died that Clara would marry him, which she never did. She said there was only one love in her life, so she never married, Brahms never married. But his dates of 1833 to 1897, he wrote this, a German Requiem, which is a very interesting name, and it specifies it because we always assume a Requiem is in Latin, and now this is in German. It was composed over 11 years' time, and it was performed in 1868. It doesn't have the traditional Latin text of the Requiem, and it is not in Latin, as you could guess. The non-liturgical German texts that he used are from the Lutheran Bible. He actually writes this in 7 movements, and he takes from the Old, the New Testament, and the Apocrypha. When you listen to it, the forces include a chorus, an orchestra, and 2 soloists, a soprano and baritone. Who did he write it for? We're not sure. In 1856, he had the death of his mother that he was grieving about, and also the death of Schumann, his friend, Robert Schumann. So we never really know, and there's nothing that really indicates for whom he wrote this, or what he was thinking about when he was deciding on writing this German Requiem. You're going to be listening to the sixth movement, where you're going to hear the texts are from Hebrews, Corinthians, Revelation. And the dramatic text climax is the very famous death. Where is thy sting, hell? Where is thy victory? The one thing you're going to notice when you're listening to this is it doesn't have the doom and gloom of being judged, but rather the hope and comfort for the living with their loss of their loved one. And you have a sense that he's trying to give you the sense of comfort with the words he's chosen instead of the doom and gloom of the Berlioz. So these are the two requiems. I would like you to be able to answer the questions about these requiems from listening to the piece, to the Grand Master Mort, and as well as the German Requiem, the two movements, Movement 2 of the Dies Irae, and Movement 6 of the German Requiem. And answer the questions. I have given you the translation so that you can see what is happening musically with the text, because it's very important as to how both composers have used that as an important foundation for their two performance pieces known as Requiem. That ends the video on the Requiem, and we will continue with another topic for the second part of this week. You will have two each week that will have questions that you'll have to answer. Talk to you soon.